You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority. But the state is still formidable. Or is it? You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society. Let's dive headfirst into The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today, I'd like to welcome as my guest, Dylan Allman. Dylan, welcome to The White Pill Box.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Folks, if you like thinking, you may want to consider subscribing to Dylan's website called Interlinked. In its own words, it is a navigation of the nexus of technology, identity, and existence. So Dylan, in case anyone wants that in layman's terms, how would you put it?
Well, I think a lot of people struggle with understanding who they are and what they're about today, especially with the information age over the last couple decades, and very much so in the last few years or so with the advent of AI and the implications of that. From here on out, it's very difficult to navigate such a thing. And my blog has been sort of my creative outlet or project in that respect. Just trying to get out my own thoughts, but also help people understand how to think nowadays. It's become very difficult for a lot of people to take the time to understand themselves and to just know how to think. It's a very difficult thing to do. Most people will just want to sit back and just kind of accept what's in front of them, or accept a sort of constellation of opinions that their tribes subscribes to, and that's very easy. And I try to make a point to say, hey, this might be easy, but it's taking away from your selfhood by doing such a thing. Because ultimately, the people that you are borrowing from or following are ultimately doing it for themselves. So why not do it for yourself? Or if the person you're following isn't doing it for themselves, they're doing it for someone else, you're going to get far enough down the chain where someone is going to be living their life for themselves. So why not just do that yourself instead of contributing to that lineage?
I like it. I've thought often of how our brains are our fundamental tool as a species. And I think what you're saying is use that tool, use it the best you can. And guidelines like the kind that you give in your various blogs, I think help us. It helps us hone that. It forces us to think. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, Interlinked. It's I don't know if it's been a few years since it came out, but Blade Runner 2049 is just one of my favorite things ever. It's a very deeply philosophical film if you take the time to analyze it. And Interlinked is a direct reference to I forget exactly what the test is called, but it's the updated version of the void comp test from the original Blade Runner film, where Officer K, or Joe, sits in front of the machine, which is also the logo of the blog, where the speaker is essentially asking him these response questions, measuring how stable his emotional state is and how much sort of individuality he's exhibiting, and the less the better. They call him Constant K in the film. Because as soon as these replicants start to develop their own identity, they become less. They become less likely to comply, and so that's what that test is for. And my blog is sort of the inverse of that, if that makes sense. It's trying to not necessarily measure, but encourage the opposite of that.
And you have to do it because with yours in particular, you have a real economy. Your prose has a real economy of concepts. There's a lot packed in to a small amount of space. That's even true of the topic we'll discuss today, which is your recent post. And is that something you developed over time? Did you practice that? Is that something that is natural to you?
To be honest, it's something that I've worked on over the last few years. My my wife has one of her biggest criticisms of me as a person is that I struggle to practice brevity. She's very much in the other direction where she will. She likes things to come quick and fast, and she's going to get bored if she feels like something's being repeated or she already understands it and someone's still talking. And that's very much like the kind of person I am. And so she's had to learn how to, come close to the middle, and then, me as well. So that's something I've worked on significantly over the last few years. Also, with these new AI tools, I use AI tools like all day, every day. I talk to AI chat models to get thoughts out. I use it to help me understand things, research things, help me refine my writing or give me ideas for writing. And that's just been, a lot of people will get upset that AI is sort of used as a crutch or something that is keeping you from exercising that part of your brain. But for me, it's been the exact opposite experience. Having that tool readily available has made me more enthusiastic about exercising that part of my brain, because I have essentially a partner to work with at any time. And so a lot of that has been skills that I have worked with the AI models on refining it for myself, and also refining certain models to understand my voice better so they can help me write pieces as well. So it's a lot of things, but it's been something that I've deliberately worked on over the last few years.
That's wonderful. I hear a lot of the same kind of concerns over AI, and I don't really buy it too much. To me, it is certainly a wonderful and very advanced new tool we have, but it is, after all, a tool. And what we're going to do with that tool is really up to us. And like you, I probably don't use it to the depth that you do, but when I do it for some creative purpose, I'll input as best I can. I'll look at my output. I'll refine my inputs to course correct. And then I'm always looking at the end result anyway. I mean, I'm proofreading it, and sometimes I'm just stunned at how it has expressed something more eloquently than I can. And I don't worry too much about the question of who did that exactly? Where did that come from? Well, it came from that nexus. It came from that intersection of us and technology and the information that it's using at its database. So I think as excited about it as you are.
It's great. I love it. I mean, a lot of people are very just super anti-AI, or like, hey, you used AI to help you with this, so like it doesn't really count. And to me, I mean, like, whatever. If you don't want to count it, I don't really care. But for me, there is a product that's being developed, regardless if it's exclusively AI, exclusively human, or a mixture of the two. And I like to look at the end product and judge the end product for what it is, and go from there. I'm not very concerned with how it got to that point when judging its value. But for me, like you said, if I'm using AI to help me with something, I'm signing off on it, the end product. I'm not going to release something that I don't fully believe in myself. It's not like I'm just like, hey, AI, give me an opinion on UBI, and then just post that without even looking at it. Who cares? Like, I'm going to proofread it. I'm going to tweak it in ways that I think will make it sound better, and I'm going to work with it to create a product that I'm proud of. And so I think as long as I just kind of have begun dismissing people that just have this reactionary response to AI. I think it's not useful. In fact, I think it's very damaging to to technological progress. So not a big fan of those types.
There's something of a parallel to that in normal creativity. I can't tell you how many times I've heard an author of a successful movie or book or whatever interviewed years after it's gained enormous success. And how many times I've heard them say, you know, the message that people got out of that, that was not what I intended at all. When I was writing it, I had this in mind or that in mind. And yet the fans and the popularity of it took it in a whole different direction, and it became its own cultural phenomenon independent of what was intended. Well, what do you call that? I mean, to me, that is not all that different than when AI is helping us become more creative or change how we do things slightly to improve it.
Right.
I don't see any difference in kind between those two examples.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, you are a force on Twitter, meaning an intellectual force, and you recently published, as you put it, the core of your political philosophical foundation. In a nutshell, authorship to jurisdiction to ownership. I jotted that down. That's an example of the efficiency of prose that I like. And you call it lean, non-moralized, and built for coordination. So, if you don't mind, since some of our listeners are not necessarily philosophical, could you pack it into sort of a quick, brief summary?
Sure. So, sort of the reason why, a little background, the reason I put this together was because I don't really neatly fit into some of these boxes because I'm very sympathetic to anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism, anarchism, just in general, but these sort of like philosophical foundations or explanations or backings, I always find myself like internally pushing back on some of it. Like some of it is just doesn't sit right with me. So I thought, well, I felt the need to sort of put my foundations onto paper and say, okay, this is where I'm at. This is how I got there, and now I feel comfortable with it. And that's sort of how my mind works, is if I feel like insecure about a certain belief I have, that's one of my favorite feelings in the world. And working to try and secure that is just one of my favorite things, and I'll get kind of obsessive over it. This was an endeavor that I started, and when I did, I mean, I remember I was up till like 3:30 a.m. until I felt comfortable enough to go to sleep, writing this down. So essentially, the sort of summary of it is I really made an attempt to try and outline, because I'm very sympathetic with Hoppe's argumentation ethics. It's a very interesting, very worthwhile endeavor that he took. But I'll have holdups here and there. So my attempt was to kind of create a thinner, like you said, non-moralized form of argumentation ethics without any attempts at objective truth claims. And so I'm not outlining some sort of like axiom or some sort of like political theology or something. And I try to just begin with something you really just can't deny. It's just something that everyone does, which is just act. And from there, we treat each person who's acting as a source of commitments. And then from there, we run the possible allocations of bodily control through what I call a discourse test and a coordination test. And from those two tests, only what I call personal jurisdiction survives, which is each person has full authority over their body, which is physically scarce. And for a real durable sort of stranger-to-stranger coordination, that same authority, that same jurisdiction that people have needs a public standing, which I would then call ownership. And then the sort of titles that follow that ownership start by what I would call a publicly intelligible first use, and then updates over time through consent when transfer occurs. And so to me, it was an attempt to sort of ask less of the reader when it comes to biting the bullet with like deep philosophical foundations, and then also scale better, like bake in the scaling to the foundation itself.
Perfect. Perfect. Good summary. And I like how you started with action, because action is the fundamental thing we do, as opposed to inaction. When we're doing nothing, there's really no social component to that at all, until acting happens. Now, a common, maybe not that common, but a common enough debate among thinkers in this regard is whether action has to be purposeful or whether mere behavior, like any twitch of my arm, counts as behavior. Could you expound on that a little if you have heard of that distinction?
I've heard of that distinction. I think it's a worthwhile thing to think about, but ultimately, even the unconscious actions that we may take are still ultimately going to be informed by either decisions that we made or things outside of our control. I mean, we're ultimately made up of a culmination of our environment, our genetics, our experiences over time, and whatever choices we make along the way, which will ultimately be informed by those three things. And so even if an unconscious behavior you have this sort of knee-jerk response to like the smell of hairspray or something. Maybe you were beat as a child and your mom smelled like hairspray, so every time your wife sprays hairspray, you kind of wince a little. Like that's still, whether you were like, I am going to wince right now, it's still ultimately informed by it. So you are, I would say, the author of your actions, because your actions are ultimately going to be decided by your brain, regardless if you know that you're about to make them or not. And so that base consciousness, that base felt experience that is deciding those actions, whether conscious or unconscious, still ultimately come from the same place of authorship. And that was kind of where I was trying to come from, is that that action comes from that base authorship, and we use that authorship, that first person experience, to then exercise that jurisdiction over our physical body, which is physically scarce. My physical body is not abundant, and so the next step would be where do we go there from there, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So let me start with the extreme example of someone hearing this and saying, whatever, I'm going to steal your stuff anyway. Take that obvious, clear, ridiculous example and now tie it into the ethic of your conclusions to show us how we can judge it as a wrong act, if that's how you would judge it.
Sure. I think what differentiates what I've laid out from a more traditional libertarian philosophical base is that I wouldn't say that it's a wrong behavior. I wouldn't go as far to make an ethical claim. What I would say is, now, since this person has decided to engage in an action that is contradictory or does not pass both the discourse and or coordination filter, now they're going to have to pay the price of that, which makes this more of a coordination problem. They've decided that they're not going to respect the jurisdiction over either my body or, you said, stealing something from me. So now they will have to pay the price of now me stepping in to defend myself, or the damaging of their reputation for further coordination with other strangers. And they're going to have to deal with those consequences. And so my point of laying this out isn't to say they are objectively or morally wrong in their behavior. It's that, hey, if you are an individual that is seeking to cooperate peacefully within a society of strangers, this is going to be the structure in which you will, or that will minimize potential conflict. And so if you do something in contradictory to this standard, then you are inviting and or contributing to said conflict. And if that's what they want, then okay, but you're gonna run into a lot of pushback.
And there's a consistency to that. And I'm not calling it objective in the sense of tied into the fabric of the universe. I mean, it's objectively ascertainable that
Right.
there's an expectation of consistency. So if body jurisdiction is respected and someone else also respects it, there's consistency there. If that person instead punches you in the nose, well, then they can expect consistency in kind, like you said, defense of self, possible restitution, whatever it may be, as consequences to that particular form of behavior.
And to be clear, this also avoids the issue with people debating on what the boundaries of the non-aggression principle are. And I see this all the time where people go, okay, well, the non-aggression principle, initiating force, when is that force no longer being initiated? And you have people that will argue against the concept of restitution because they say, okay, well, once someone has hit you, they're no longer in the act of initiating force. So why is it acceptable to then initiate force to them afterwards to put them in prison? Because now that the force has ended, you're creating more force, putting them in a cage. And then critics of that argument would say something like, well, since they've punched you in the nose, they've forfeited their expectation of having force initiated against them. So even though it's maybe 3 months down the road, me putting them in a cage for restitution purposes is me just defending myself. And so you have these clashes of arguments of what is right and what is wrong and what adheres to this non-aggression principle. And I would say that's fine. The problem is the non-aggression principle is often rooted in this objective sense of morality, and these people are debating on whether this is morally right or wrong and where that line is. And to me, it just sounds like they're debating on what is the best form of coordination, which is all I'm trying to do. I'm just trying not to bake in those moralisms that other people tend to do.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that's where the consistency comes in, because now there's at least an expectation of consistency, and you can ask, why that? Why is that even a good thing? And you phrased it as reducing collisions. I like that expression, reducing collisions, which I think yesterday's Twitter exchange, it's more or less the same thing as minimizing conflict. This was your expression of it. Is that accurate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. I would just... The reason I said collisions is because it's conflict has a sort of typical interpretation to it where it's always like a bad thing. Like we're in conflict. Collision is just like, hey, two people want to do something that is just contradictory. I can't do the same. If I have a stick and I want to use this stick to sharpen into a spear, and someone else wants to use the stick to stoke a fire, we're not necessarily in, we are in, it depends on how you're trying to use the word. I just tried to, conflict just has more of a aggressive interpretation to it than just like, hey, we're kind of colliding on our, how we want to use this thing.
I want to talk, slight tangent here, I want to talk about how it is that we notice cultural norms, at least cultural norms when a population is permitted to be more or less free. And even in the historical examples where we've had anarchist or near anarchist territories seem to converge on this sort of ethic anyway, not to the deep philosophical extent, obviously, but natural human behavior does seem to converge this way. And more or less self-ownership, more or less property rights, more or less peace and non-aggression. How do you look upon that convergence where we see we see two things that you might think might be utterly disparate, natural human behavior in the wild versus thinking it through and arriving at what appears to be the exact same conclusions?
Well, I think just violence hurts. Like, people don't like pain. People don't like to suffer. People like to thrive. People like to have other people that they care about and create families, and getting in fights all the time is not conducive to that. And I think that's like ultimately what, like, where that is. And so the best way to do that, the best way to minimize that conflict, reduce those collisions that lead to large scale violence and conflict, or even small scale, is to just have those norms where you respect other people's bodily jurisdiction and respect their property, because if not, you're just going to consistently invite conflict, and I just don't think anybody wants that. And I think where we do see large scale conflicts and all of this violence is when such a thing gets introduced as what it isn't. And so we see the advent of the modern state structure. There's a reason why it is presented in the way that it is. If it was presented like more honestly, less people would buy into it. It would have less power. If it was just, hey, we're just a gang of powerful people that want to rule over you and siphon you of your money and use this money to create more conflict around the world to grow our power. Like, I think less people would be cool with that. And so there is this necessary mysticism that needs to surround the modern structure of the state and disguise itself as something that it isn't. I think I've heard Dave Smith say this a lot, where he says the state is, I forget exactly how he said it, it's like a gang of thugs disguised as a human rights organization. And so that, I'm just kind of assuming that the rebuttal to what I said to begin with would be like, okay, well, there is conflict and stuff all the time, and large scale war and all this. And I think it's because of the way that the modern state is structured to convince people that it's something that it isn't, and manipulate people into identifying with the state itself. So when you have other countries or other states fight other states, it makes people think they're fighting me. And so now they feel this sense of duty, this sense of, I need to defend myself, and it all just sort of stems from that. So I think when you see on a more tribal level these people just cooperating with each other and being peaceful, I think you see that to break down as these societies get larger and people are like, hey, let's create this state thing. And that's when I think it becomes a problem.
Oh, awesome. You've basically hit on and, in a sense, touched on and summarized the very essence of what my podcast is about here, which is the psychology of statism. And you even covered a few of the topics of my 23-part Myth of Authority series, which deals exactly with this. It's this causal loop that starts with this myth of political authority in the minds of people, which is the foundationally causal factor that leads to the state apparatus. Whatever particular form it takes is really not important, how it's instantiated. It's the fact that this myth is the necessary factor that leads to a state. But then the state relies on that, obviously, since it's causal. But it is, after all, like you said, it's a myth. It's a fiction, which means as a false thing, it cannot survive the light of day over time, which means you need propaganda. You need to lie. You need to make up some story that makes it look like you absolutely have to have the state. And that's where propaganda fits in, again, as a causal factor in this. And of course, the libertarian efforts over these last 50 years is kind of to poke at that point and say, hey, let's get people's minds immune from that propaganda so that they don't believe that they need a state. And if they don't believe they need an overarching political ruler, well, with the tipping point, you wouldn't have the state at all because of that causal necessity. That's very compact, but that's
not to crap on myths in general. Myths are fun. Myths are great. They can be very useful. It's when they have a direct causal relationship with our everyday lives that it can become a problem. Because if the myth is not parallel to the truth, then we have a problem. You can create myths that illustrate very real archetypes in the real world, and they can be very useful to understanding how the real world works. But when you have a myth like political authority that's just straight up not consistent, not true in the sense of this is how the world works, like you're just making something up and using it to justify these acts that regular people wouldn't otherwise think are justified. Now you're just manipulating people. So I totally agree.
It also explains, I think, the half century of relative failure, or at least meager results of the libertarian efforts. Because, and I'm part of this, by the way, I was red-pilled in 1975. I go way back. And I can tell you all through that time, right up to this very day, the thrust of libertarian messaging efforts, and I want to make clear that I'm distinguishing messaging and activism from more foundational scholarly work, has been meager. Why? Because, in my view, they've attacked the symptom. They've attacked the state. They've said, state is bad. You shouldn't have, whatever, this counselor or this senator or whatever. It's been very, outcome oriented rather than noticing that it's all rooted in a ubiquitous false belief. If you could focus your efforts on noticing there's this belief and that belief is false, well, at a tipping point, the state can't function because people would disregard it into obscurity. So you don't really have to worry about as much changing laws unless it's something that's very specific, very targeted. But in general, the efforts of libertarians has been toward dealing with the symptom, the cancer with a Band-Aid on it, so to speak.
I think the myth isn't just false in that it's a myth. Like, obviously, when you're dealing with myths and the truth of the myths, you're not talking about like in a literal truth. When people talk about myths, it's like, is the message of the myth, is it true in that it parallels the reality in which we live? And Jordan Peterson talks about it all the time, where when someone will ask him, is this true? He's like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean, am I literally going to see, Zeus right in front of me? Like, no, but is this story something that will be valuable and could be useful in parallels with the actual reality in which we live? When we say the state or the myth of political authority is false, it's not just that the concept of police officer is false, whatever. It's that what they're trying to sell with this myth is not parallel with the reality in which we live. And we know this by looking at the personal interactions between individuals, and we know what is acceptable and what isn't between those individuals. But when it's blown up into the size of a modern state apparatus, and they start using this myth to sell those very things that would be unacceptable between individuals or small groups of people as legitimate and true, that's when I go as far to say that myth is false, because it just isn't consistent with what, not only with what it's preaching, but with what people at a much smaller scale would find acceptable.
Oh, yeah. And it's also self-contradictory, because we are free will beings. I mean, even if you don't believe in free will, effectively, we are all exercising free will for practical purposes, because we can't predict what others would do. Okay, well, if we are agents over ourself and making, if you want to say moral or whatever ethical judgments in our actions, and then we have this myth of political authority that says, well, except for this class of people who are rulers over us, politicians, law enforcement, whoever it might be, who, if they make a pronouncement, we are obligated morally to obey them. Well, that's an inherent contradiction so far as I can see, because if we are exercising free will, we're still willing we're willing ourselves to obey what they say. We are still in the driver's seat in that fundamental sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that.
When we talk about acting, I want to get back to that for a second. Do you think of it in terms of discrete actions, or is it really more conceptual that you use it? And I say that because sometimes in some of the libertarian debates about participation in politics, evaluations and judgments are made based on composite actions by politicians. He's good on that, he's bad on that, he's sort of good on that, he freed Ross here, he didn't do this. All together, and when I sum it all up and make a net calculated balance of that, I see that he would be better or worse than if the alternative had come in based on my calculated summary of what they might have done. Or do you tend to more see acting as more granular?
I think why people feel the urge to judge acting on a less granular level is due to the circumstances that we're currently in, and that these representatives that are being elected will necessarily be in charge of so much because the government is so large and has control over so much that and your choices are very limited, regardless of the level of government. That you look at two options and you say, okay, well, if I'm going to have to choose between these two, I have no choice but to judge these actions on a less granular scale, which I think is that's terrible. Like, we shouldn't have to do that. Like, I think that is a symptom and really illustrates how too large the state is. I shouldn't have to weigh the policy positions of a representative and look at a website that has like 300 different policy positions. It just shouldn't matter. If I am deciding in my local community who's going to be the leader of my chess club, I don't need to know their opinion on abortion, But now these representatives from the state have grown so powerful and so large that if you're going to engage as an informed voter, whatever that means, you are sort of forced to do that. And I think that's a huge disservice to how we work. Me personally, I'm going to look on a much granular level. I think that is a luxury that most people don't have or aren't exactly willing to do. I think a lot of people, may be too busy in their lives to think about things on a more granular level in that respect. I think people just may not value taking the time to do that, which I think is totally valid, especially when it comes to politics. I would like to live in a world where in order to be an informed voter, you have to spend like hours on end studying about the policy positions of all of these different representatives at all these different levels of government to decide which one is going to be forced to represent you. I think that's just a really bad setup. And I totally understand if people just don't want to do that. They just want to go home and hang out with their family after their long days of work, of providing for said family. And it's like, it sucks. It's like a double-edged sword. It's like you don't pay attention, you're going to have these people ruling over you and you have no say. If you do pay attention, it's going to take up your life from what you would otherwise value doing. It's not a great setup. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It does. I often, I've thought a lot about the recent libertarian, you'll see them a lot, libertarian camps that will favor political involvement and others that take the more principled stance of no, you should not. And I've thought about how it really does boil down to whether a person is comfortable putting actions into a composite and doing that sort of net sum analysis. And the ones who do advocate for participation and picking one over another are basically in that camp. Don't even bother judging it. That's how they are comfortable looking at it. And the principled, as a rule, tend to look at it and say, I can't not see the individual actions as self-contained. And so if a politician is going to make any decision that creates a new innocent victim, that's a bad thing, and I can't put my imprimatur to that person by voting. And that's what they're comfortable doing. And instead, I don't think they bring out these two fundamental preferences, and instead just start arguing with each other. And it's a lot of infighting, to me, over nothing. Either put yourself in one camp or the other, and then, leave it at that.
I totally see both sides of that, because at the end of the day, like if we shouldn't be in the situation that we're in, but we are, and if you're not comfortable putting your name in public record of having voted for this politician, I think that's totally acceptable to just refrain. I don't think refraining is going to make some sort of like difference. I think people that don't vote out of a sense of I'm going to stick it to the man, I think that's kind of ridiculous. But I understand not feeling comfortable doing that. I haven't voted. Well, I voted a couple weeks ago, but that was because, and that's another thing, people that have a principled stance on voting across the board, I think can borderline on kind of ridiculous. For example, a few weeks ago, when the election happened in Austin, we had one thing up to vote for the city, and that was to raise property taxes by 25%. Like, I'm sorry, but like, if that's on the ballot and I could just say yes or no, I want, as a homeowner, my property taxes to go up or down, I'm going to go say I want it to be down, and that's going to have a very immediate effect, because of course, a lot of people in Austin that own homes very much mobilized, and that got shot down by like 80%. If someone has a principled stance against engaging with the state on that level, in that context, I'm just not going to buy it. Like, I'm sorry, I'm going to go do that. I understand a little bit more of the stance of voting for representatives. I can understand that you are in some respect deciding for other people who's going to rule over them. So I get that, but also people that are trying to take a more practical step here, in that, hey, if you get it down to like the most granular level of understanding, I mean, you can imagine yourself as a slave, living on a plantation, and you've got two guys up for election to be the master of the plantation, and one of them you feel like is probably going to whip you less. And I wouldn't be like, how dare you go in there and vote for the guy who's going to whip you less. I would understand, like, you're in a situation in which you're going to be ruled over regardless, and if you have an option to be ruled by someone that's going to be less oppressive, and you're going to choose that one, I understand that. So I don't fault either. I also, you mentioned looking at each action on a granular level. I would say people that are one issue voters, I think, I think can borderline on ridiculous. For example, it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to vote for Donald Trump because he's going to free Ross. That's a great thing, and I'm glad that he did that. But take that to the absurd degree. He's going to free Ross, but then he's going to what? He's going to like send the military to lock everyone in their homes, and you could think of an absurd situation where your one issue might be satisfied, but they're going to be so unfathomably terrible in everything else. I also think that is sort of a removal of intellectual responsibility. You just don't want to take everything in. You just want to say, okay, I have this one issue, and if they satisfy it, I'm just going to vote for them. You're doing yourself and the people around you a disservice by not exercising any sort of further discretion on that matter. So that's sort of my summary of my beliefs on voting.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's awful that we're put in that position. The analogy I use is if people are in a concentration camp or given a vote over whether they have milk at breakfast or just plain water, and they vote for the milk. It's like, well, you didn't want to be in that situation in the first place. If you're
Right.
given any chance to make your situation slightly better, you're stupid not to take it. I mean, you're only hurting
And
yourself.
it's not like the concentration camp runners are going to be like, man, none of them voted. I guess we're just going to let them go free. Like, that's not going to make a difference. They're going to
Exactly.
continue to rule over you regardless. They've had this lapse of control where they're like, hey, we'll allow you to make this decision. And I just don't see any issue with engaging in that, being in this situation where you're under duress on like a very significant level.
I brought up before foundational messaging versus traditional activism, and I want to make clear that I would classify your recent core principles as as foundational in nature. I make that distinction because I've come to feel that standard messaging and activism really isn't as effective as we might have hoped it might have been all these decades. But the scholarly foundational work, to me, is the opposite. It's utterly essential, so that as free enclaves and territories and societies emerge, they will need foundational principles at minimum. And all this work, like yourself and of course the 50 years of work we've seen in scholarly work in economics, legal theory, it's all essential to that because they won't have to reinvent the wheel when they are establishing these enclaves. They will have something to go back on and to start from. Do you see it that way in any sense?
I tend to not get far into deep hypotheticals like that. I mean, I don't know how realistic, but just like within the near future, how realistic a truly free sort of enclave of people actually is. So I don't spend a lot of time really thinking about what that may look like. Although, I mean, that's a totally fair endeavor. I think the scholarly effort is probably more driven for people's personal philosophies. So, like, I think if you don't know or understand, like, everyone's going to have a personal philosophy, whether you understand what it is or not. Your personal philosophy is what drives you to have the positions you do on things, to decide the actions that you're going to take. It's how you weigh your value judgments. Everyone has one, whether they understand it themselves or not. And what I have found is that if people don't understand their own personal philosophy, they're just kind of borrowing it from the other people, whether it be the people in their general vicinity or the people in positions of power that it is within their interest to manipulate people into following the things that they say. And so I think it's important to dig deep and understand what your own personal philosophy is. And I think you can do that very well by engaging with these scholarly efforts of people that are doing the same thing, and knowing how to think about philosophy and how to come to that yourself. Because the thing that I wrote out for my political philosophy, it very obviously was influenced by a lot of different things, but it is ultimately my own personal philosophy, and I wouldn't have even known to do that if I wouldn't have engaged with these other people that are engaged in these scholarly efforts by saying, oh, I like everything that this person said, but there's this one part that's kind of rubbing me the wrong way. Let me find a way to like bake this in where I can write it out and then, sidestep this part or do something. I would have never known to think about that unless I had engaged with these people that are in these efforts. So I think it's very important in that respect as well.
Was there a point in your life when you would consider yourself as more or less red-pilled? Like, was there a shift for you, or have you kind of had these? Can you?
I mean, I think the point that I typically will point to is very young in adulthood. I mean, I'm only 28 right now, but when I was like right at 18 years old. Well, actually, it was before that. This was in high school. I was, I think, 16, 17. I was raised very religious and conservative household. I had a girlfriend in high school that was very rebellious. I mean, we were both raised in a very religious household. She was very much just a reactionary, rebellious teen, of just like, oh, I screw this God guy. I'm just, whatever. But I was still very much aligned with that, the way that I was raised. And that made for a very interesting coupling between us. But there was at one point we were walking around the town square, and there was a street preacher. And we were just walking around, holding hands, whatever. And she looked over to me as we passed the preacher and was like, Dylan, am I going to hell? And I hadn't really thought about it before, but in that moment I thought about it, and I was like, well, she says she doesn't believe in God and all this stuff. And I was just like, yeah, and that sucks. There's this girlfriend that I had in high school, and it was, basically believe that she's going to go and suffer forever in eternal damnation. And I really started to think about it more that night, and I was like, this is bad. I don't want this of my girlfriend. I'm just kind of accepting that that's how this is. Let me make sure that I have a good reason to believe this, because this belief is very hard for me to reconcile. It's really making me uncomfortable. And that led me down this path of skepticism that really started with my religion, in which I grew up with, and that started to spread in ways like taking that to my youth group and having conversations, and then talking about different interpretations of the Bible, and why our youth pastor decided that we're going to use one Bible over the other, and why we only go and play kickball with the other Methodist church across town and not with the Baptist church that shares a parking lot with us. And from there, then thinking, well, what else if I just kind of taken for granted that I may not believe when put under further scrutiny? And like we were talking about before, that myth of authority very quickly got put under the microscope and was cast away almost just as fast.
Did you consult other scholarly works at that time? Did any particular reading material resonate with you?
For sure. I mean, my religious deconstruction was started very stereotypically. I mean, this was sort of at the height of the new atheist movement. So people like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or what's his name? It's Christopher Hitchens. Those were all very formative at that time for that. When I started to engage politically, it was very vanilla libertarian to begin with. I think the first libertarian book that I ever read was called The Libertarian Mind by David Boaz. And then from there, you just get more and more radicalized. The most formative, I think, political work that I read was probably The Greatest Superstition by Larken, and then further refined by the Myth of Political Authority by Humor, which I saw you had on your podcast, which is great. That book is phenomenal. And those are probably the two most formative in that respect. And then when it comes to like coordination, for sure, Rothbard's economic writings. I read The Man, Economy, and State front to back while I was in the Army, and that was very eye-opening economically.
Nice. That's a beautiful body of work, and Larken Rose's work and Humor's work are fundamental for me too, and they are quite the launching off point for my podcast series, where I've really dug far deeper into this than I'm aware of anyone having done, although I'm still looking around for psychological works that match it. We're right about at the hour, and I have really enjoyed this. I wanted to hand it over to you in case there's any projects or other topics that you wanted to cover with us today.
I would say not a whole lot. I mean, I spent a lot of time writing out my political foundation. I'm not super. It wasn't like I'm going to try and do a press tour and try to push this everywhere. It was really just to satisfy my own thoughts, and I tend to also put my thoughts online, so I figured why not? I would put that there. So if people want to read that, that would be cool. My Twitter account, I tend to put stuff out there, as well as my interlinked blog. I was thinking of maybe starting a more general blog, because interlinked is very hyper focused on certain themes. So maybe creating something that is more general would be nice. I think this group of libertarians or ANCAPs, it's a very niche ideology, and because of that, I think a lot of people are kind of aligned on a lot of things, and people that come from a place, and me and my wife are very similar in this respect, which makes our relationship really cool. That from a worldview or foundation from a more egoist or Max Stirner foundation of egoism, where I tried to avoid these moralisms or objective reality truth statements. I think libertarians that come from that foundation are very few and far between, and there's not really anything for them. Most works out there have a lot of these objective ethics sort of baked in, and that could be very difficult or sort of impossible for somebody in my place to swallow. And so if anyone's listening that has a similar makeup as I do, and wants a sort of, for lack of a better word, like a logical proof in a similar sense as Hobbes' argumentation ethics that doesn't pull at those strings, that was sort of my attempt at doing that. So,
right.
That's about
it. Yeah, that's awesome. I'll be linking to the Twitter thread for that core principle, and you're interlinked as well, and also the Anti-Subjectivist Manifesto, which I had read about a year ago, I guess, and there's some real parallels there, as the follow-up thread to your thread has shown. And I'll probably drop Patrick Smith a line, who is he runs Anarchist, and he was part and parcel of that. So I think there's alignment there too. But anyway, I think that's a really great place to wrap up today. So thank you so much, Dylan, for joining me today on the White Pill Box. I really enjoyed meeting you.
Of course. I enjoyed meeting you as well.
And folks, be sure to check out the show notes for the information about Dylan that I'll be posting, and I promise it will get you thinking. And as always, thank you to everyone out there for joining us today. Take care, and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.